Highness.
سوف تستمع الجمعيه العامه لبيان يلقيه دولة السيد Xavier Bettel رئيس
The General Assembly will now listen to an address by Mr. Xavier Bettel, Prime Minister, Minister of State and Minister of Communication and Media and Religious Affairs of the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg. I would request protocol to escort His Excellency to the podium.
يسعدني كثيرا أن أرحب بدولة
I am very happy to welcome here to the United Nations Mr. Xavier Bettel, Prime Minister, Minister of State of Communications, Media and Religious Affairs of the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, and I would now invite him to address the General Assembly. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. President. Notre secrétaire général nous...
Our Secretary General yesterday provided us with his view as to the international situation and the challenges that we must all tackle. He provided us with a mixed assessment, and if I may say so, to say the least, we face a retreat in multilateralism on all fronts and calling into question of the foundations of the international system based on the respect for the rule of law. For democracies, multilateralism and the respect for the rule of law are, however, guarantees of their ability to play a role internationally. They are indeed a condition to exercise their sovereignty. The need to highlight the merits of multilateralism can be seen nowhere more than in the common and joint projects to establish and maintain peace, and the European Union is a fantastic example in this regard. And I'm part of the generation that was born on the European continent and has never experienced war. And we feel that this has already been achieved, but we shouldn't forget that conflictual situations exist on our continent. This is also the case when it comes to international trade. So, in this regard, the escalation of measures, countermeasures, and counter-multilateral measures will lead to undermining the growth of all. We are decisively in favour of a return to negotiation and to constructive involvement and engagement within the WTO. Otherwise, we shall all be losers. Of course, this means that we need to be open to discussion on some difficult, sensitive issues. Some challenges can only find a solution at the global level. And believe me, migration is an excellent example of this. Demographic trends mean that this issue will most likely be on the agenda for some generations to come. We do hope that the Global Pact on safe, regular and orderly migration, which will be adopted in Marrakesh in December this year, will provide a framework to tackle this global phenomenon in the states of origin, transit and destination. This should also enable better management of migration flows at the regional level. We know that within the European Union, we must set up joint policies and create solidarity mechanisms amongst member states with respect to hosting refugees. And it is sad to note today that some countries have forgotten that one day they themselves were refugees across the world. My country has thus undertaken significant efforts since 2015 to host asylum seekers, including through resettlement and relocalization mechanisms. The global framework for the Global Pact on Migration has made it possible to ascertain what is expected of states of origin and destination states, but also, very importantly, what is expected of migrants in terms of integration. We have often associated integration with the rise in populism in Europe. And let me say that we saw in the European Union that various countries have endowed themselves with populist governments before the 2015 migration crisis. These are the same countries that today are problematic when we talk about the foundations of the European Union with respect to upholding the values of the rule of law. And today, we note that some political parties are successful because they benefit from the weakest, and this is something that I condemn. Of course, there is a very clear-cut distinction that we need to draw between political refugees and economic migrants. those who wish to survive, who wish to flee rape, violence, persecution, prison, and death, must find security on our continent. Dear colleagues, we've also heard the warning issued by the Secretary General, but also the warning from the scientific world, and that is, if we continue on the current path, we will not attain the goals of the Paris Agreement. We do not know precisely to what extent man is involved in climate change, global warming, but we do have the facts, and that are that month after month, year after year, they tell us with a great deal of certainty that we must take action and that we are responsible vis-à-vis future generations. I can only but welcome all initiatives taken to maintain or regain the momentum of the Paris Agreement, including the Secretary General's proposal to convene a new summit on climate next year in the margins of the General Assembly. Controlling climate change is one of the most significant goals of the 2030 Agenda. The implementation of this agenda through the 17 SDGs is on the right track, and the international community is mobilized, particularly at the national level. We are aware, of course, that each member state has the leeway to underscore their specific priorities. Evidently, the issue of financing the SDGs remains problematic. With respect to climate change, specific mechanisms have been set up both internationally and nationally, but there's also been mobilization in the private sector. The mechanisms exist, but the means remain insufficient. In Luxembourg, we've set up a green grant, which for the time being has capitalization of 50 billion, which is the most significant of its kind. We are also pursuing our objective to set up similar mechanisms for other SDGs. The response of the financial sector, however, remains timid. First of all, because of the lack of awareness amongst traditional operators of the potential of new markets, but also the compliance obligations imposed upon by oversight authorities in developed countries. The share of public aid for financing, of course, we know is on the decrease, and we must find other mechanisms with respect to the means of LDCs. The need to diversify sources for development aid must not disconnect us from our obligations in terms of public financing. My country has in fact devoted 1% of its GNP to public development aid. And there's almost consensus in Luxembourg, and this must change following the legislative elections in October. In Luxembourg, we see that we have a high income, and some mothers across the world wonder whether they'll have any food to feed their children in the coming days. We forget how lucky we are, and I think it's important to be able to share this. And I know that this consensus in my country and following the legislative elections in a fortnight, I think this consensus will remain, so that the government will continue along this path. The effectiveness of aid for development, of course, doesn't only depend on financial means. The reform of the development sector by the Secretary General has our full support. In particular, we must ensure that policy and practice are aligned with respect to the UN development agencies on the agenda of sustainable development. Coordination between agencies defining common projects, implementing a new resident coordinator system would provide us with the flexibility and the necessary adaptability for an efficient implementation of development projects on the ground. I've highlighted the reforms of the Secretary General because we believe that our country plays a particular role in the sphere of development. The reforms of the peace and security sector and the management pillar of the Secretariat are, of course, very important and must receive the same energetic support. These efforts must lead to contributing to ensure that support for multilateral institutions is sustainable. The reform of the peace and security sector must enable the UN peacekeeping operations to be deployed more effectively and flexibly. Of course, the deployment modalities do not always respond to needs. Africa is one of the regions where the United Nations are the most present through peacekeeping operations, as well as programs and projects for aid for development in terms of humanitarian action. Western Africa and the Sahelian Strip today are a hotspot for instability, terrorism, organised crime and trafficking of all kinds. It's only through coordinated and concerted actions with regional players and national stakeholders, as well as international institutions, that we will be able to stem the rise of the dangers of this region. For its part, my country allocates significant portions of its development aid to the countries of the region. May I cite an example? That is to say, the action that we're conducting in Mali. Our indicative programme for the country stands at €61 million for 2015 to 2019. Luxembourg is one of the key donors of the Observer's Office, an independent Observer's Office, tasked with assessing the implementation of the agreement between the government and the armed countries in the north of the country, and finances the setting up of the International Commission of Inquiry for Mali, tasked with investigating the human rights violations and violations of humanitarian international law since 2012. Luxembourg is also contributing to drafting a framework to uphold human rights and international humanitarian law for the G5 Sahel Joint Force operations. In terms of security and defence, assistance stands approximately at €1.15 million. Since this year, my country has been taking part in MONUSCO with the progressive detachment of Luxembourgish soldiers as part of air support. Following our commitments announced during the Brussels conference in February, Luxembourg will contribute approximately €500,000 to the medical support to the G5 Sahel Joint Force and €600,000 to setting up a hospital in Sévaré. Luxembourg's contribution, of course, remains modest. I can only tell you about what a small country can contribute. International and regional coordination structures are set up and exist. The situation in the Middle East and within the Mediterranean region in Libya paint a grim picture. The stalemate of the peace process between Israel and Palestine still remains, and the context has worsened since the last session of our General Assembly. Of course, we must recognise this. We shall never tire in recalling the principles of international law, which must constitute the basis for peace. There can be no doubt whatsoever as to the right of existence for Israel or the right of Palestinians to have a state as well as a two-state solution. This is the only fair and sustainable solution. The explosive situation in Libya is the outcome of tensions which are proper to the tribal structure of the country, but also because the country is a soundbox for tensions in the Sahel and in the Arab Muslim world. The interests of the international community, first and foremost the United Nations and its special envoy, are very many. As a result of the political solution between the Libyan parties, this will depend on controlling migration flows towards Europe. Of course, we must not lock up migrants in camps and hold them in intolerable conditions of slavery in the 21st century. The war in Syria has raged and has reached in a huge humanitarian crisis. It has claimed the lives of countless persons. Half of the population are displaced within the country and are now abroad. Following the tragedy in eastern Ghouta at the beginning of this year, there are today over 3 million people who are threatened in the Idlib region. The means used in this war by the belligerent parties have been extreme through their violence and cruelty, as well as the use of chemical weapons. It is simply incomprehensible and scandalous that the international community has been incapable of a veto to set up an instrument aiming to establish the facts and perpetrators of those who've used chemical weapons. We would like the international mechanism to facilitate inquiries into the most serious violations of international law in the conflict in Syria, set up by Resolution 71248 of the General Assembly, can gather data by the joint investigative mechanism to mete out justice when it is required. The humanitarian commitment of my country in the Syrian conflict is by far the most significant and stands at €7.5 million per year for the period 2016-2020, as I announced personally during the conference in London. Luxembourg will furthermore take part in the last appeal to additional contributions from the Department for Foreign Affairs to support political efforts of the UN in Syria. It will also make available an amount of €200,000 to allow the IIM to be operational. The tragedy of the war in Syria has led to a situation which has meant that powers, regional rivalities and faith-based conflict has emerged. The humanitarian tragedy in Yemen has caused destruction, displacement, hunger and cholera. The war raging there has also been extremely cruel. We must rapidly set up means to establish responsibility and combat impunity. Our role, the role of the United Nations, in particular its Special Envoy and the Humanitarian Office, is key to avoid the situation from worsening further, and we must work towards achieving a political solution. In these two conflicts, the regional powers play an important role, which is not always that positive. This is the case for Iran. We share the concerns voiced by the United States and the Allies as to Iran's influence in the Middle East. This influence destabilizes the situation in many neighboring countries. From our viewpoint, this does not mean that we must call into question the nuclear agreement with Iran, because, of course, whilst we believe it's not perfect, it provides specific guarantees in terms of nuclear non-proliferation. We regret the fact that the US have denounced this agreement, which was subject to a Security Council resolution, which continues to bind our international community. As to nuclear non-proliferation, we very much hope that the process which began between the United States and the DPRK, with the support of South Korea, will lead to tangible results in terms of denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Sir, alongside the trend to unilateralism and calling into question the rule of law, we must nonetheless note a worsening in the human rights situation across the globe. This applies to situations of conflict, where the use of intimidation policies, ethnic cleansing, widespread sexual violence is increasingly frequent, particularly carried out by non-state actors. This is also true of the denial of the very existence of some human rights categories. And this is as a result of calling into question the legitimacy of some human rights defense institutions. The situation of the Rohingyas in the Myanmar is emblematic of this development. There is a mix here of ethnic cleansing, massacres, intimidation, and rape, with an entire population compelled to flee without the international community being able to do much. Simply, it organizes and hosts refugees in neighboring countries and notes the extent of the disaster. In this regard, one of the positive developments is the fact that the ICC has seized the situation, because over 700,000 refugees have been driven out to Bangladesh, and that this party is a party to the Rome Statute. We fully support the actions of the ICC on this issue, as well as in other investigations that it conducts. We do not accept that the legitimacy and the very existence of this institution can be called into question and using the sovereignty of states as a pretext. Pursuant to the principle of complementarity, the ICC can only intervene when states are lacking. Our support to the Human Rights Council and its action remains as strong as ever. In this institution, we see that this is a fundamental pillar of the UN system. This council may be reformed without challenging its mandate or its modus operandi, and we have endorsed efforts in this regard. However, we regret the decision taken by the United States to no longer participate in the Human Rights Council, even though that this country was an ally to the defense of human rights globally. We very much hope that the reform efforts continue, and if my country is elected to the Council for the term 2022-24, we will of course pursue our efforts. Human rights cover a number of facets, civil and political rights as well as economic and social rights, to mention but just some traditional rights. But there's also a new category of rights, in particular sexual rights and the right to reproductive health. We regret the fact that these latter are very often breached, not only in their principles, but also in their exercise, including through United Nations programs and projects, aiming to provide women and girls with the ability to destiny into their own hands and have access to family planning. In this regard, my country financially supports the UNFPA programs, as well as programs of UN Women, and the initiative Girls Not Brides, to the tune, respectively, of 600,000 and 400,000 euros for 2019. We also support a UNICEF UNFPA project to stamp out FGM, and this stands at 400,000 euros. President, our organisation provides its legitimacy to multilateralism and to all other organisations and institutions which claim multilateralism. That is why we must tirelessly take up the principle. This is the condition so that we can undertake considerable and focus on considerable areas and face globalization challenges. A return to a narrow notion of nationalism has never been an option for Luxembourg, and it is no longer today for anyone, for any of the countries in this room. Thank you.
باسم الجمعيه العامه اود ان اشكر دولة.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I would like to thank Mr. Xavier Bettel, Prime Minister, Minister of State, Minister of Communication, Minister of the Media and Religious Affairs of the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg. I would like to ask protocol to escort His Excellency out from the podium. The Assembly will now listen to a statement by His Excellency Mark Rutte, Prime Minister, Minister of General Affairs of the Netherlands. I would ask the protocol to please escort His Excellency to the podium.